Well, good morning. Atheists, agnostics, skeptics, free thinkers, whatever you like to call yourself, you are welcome here. At Seattle Atheist Church, we call ourselves an atheist church because you will never hear anything supernatural talked about at the podium. So today we have a very interesting talk. Why atheists should attend church and still be atheists.
All right, thank you everyone for coming. So let me get started. I want to start actually on a personal note. I want to start with the fact that I've always been very puzzled about religion. And that has something to do with my background. I'm a third generation atheist. My father was an atheist, my grandfather was an atheist. And it also has to do with the fact that, I spent some time in Indonesia when I was in high school, so I had a lot of contact with other religions. So given that combination of backgrounds, there's about 100% possibility of me being an atheist and about a 0% chance of me being religious because I just wasn't brought up in that tradition. And the reason I'm bringing this up is I've been puzzled by religion. It's like seeing people talk about, snowboarding all the time. They're going off every weekend and going snowboarding, and it's like, wow, maybe I should start snowboarding. What are they doing on their weekends? So what this sermon is, it's an attempt to understand, well, what is religion in America and what draws people into going to a church and actually being actively involved in a religion. So this talk is divided into two halves. In the first half, I'm going to focus on the what of religion in America. And so I'm going to draw all the information for the first part of the talk off of the largest survey on religious attitudes ever performed, the Faith Matters survey. And that's being drawn by Robert Putnam's and Campbell's book on American Grace. And so Robert Putnam was the dean of the Kennedy School at Harvard. And so it's considered sort of the gold standard of information about people's religious attitudes. So I'm going to use that for the first half of the sermon. And then for the second half of the sermon, I'm going to talk about Alain de Botton's book and address the question of why people are religious, what pulls them into religion. And that part of the talk is going to be far less data-driven, far more speculative and introspective, I guess. So let me start.
What is Alain de Botton's book called?
Oh, I'm sorry. Alain de Botton's book is called Religion for Atheists. It's his book, Religion for Atheists. All right, so let me start with the data-driven stuff. The Faith Matters survey. So this survey was given 3 times. Again, it was the largest survey of people's religious attitudes ever performed. First, it was given in 2006 to 3,106 Americans. Then the next year in 2007, they did a follow-up to 1,909 of the original participants. And then finally, they did an additional follow-up in 2011, where they found 1,810 of the original participants, and then they did a separate survey with another set of participants. So the most of the stuff I'm talking about will concern the 2006 and 2007 surveys, because the 2011 survey came out after the original book was published, and so we had to tack on an epilogue to talk about changes. But we'll talk about some of those changes when we get to it. All right, so what can we conclude from the surveys? The biggest conclusion is that America is an exceptionally religious country by any standard. It is exceptionally religious. In fact, by the measure of church attendance, Americans are actually more religious than people who live in Iran, which is a little shocking if you think about it. In terms of industrialized nations, we rank number 7. Number 1 is Jordan. Indonesia is up there as well, but we rank above Iran in terms of how often we attend, church or a synagogue or a mosque. 80% of Americans are absolutely sure there is a God. So that's 80%. 83% of Americans report belonging to a religion. So, 3% of those must be hedging their bets, or they must be, but they're going, so maybe they're a little less absolutely sure. Okay, so we're a very religious country. I want to talk a little bit about the history of religion in the United States, because, so I used to have this naive view that, you know, America started out super religious. Over time, the amount of religion declined, and, you know, we're at the point that we're at today. Actually, that's false. We have about the same level of religiousness now as we had about 70 years ago. And if anything, people have argued that we're becoming more religious. And so, but the history there is interesting. Putnam and Campbell write that since the 1950s, one major shock and two major aftershocks have shaken and cleaved the American religious landscape, successively thrusting a large portion of one generation of Americans in a secular direction, then in reaction, thrusting a different group of the population in a conservative religious direction, and finally, in counter-reaction to that first aftershock, sending yet another generation of Americans in a more secular direction. So that's a little confusing, but what's happening is over the last 70 years, we actually had a huge uptick in religion, and then it collapsed, and then we had another uptick, and then it started to collapse again. So it's actually a much more, more like a roller coaster ride. Or the metaphor these people like to use, Putnam likes to use, is the metaphor of a major earthquake and then some aftershocks after that earthquake. So what was that earthquake? Well, what happened is, let's go back to the 1950s. We're in the early 1950s right now. And in the early 1950s, right in the mid-1950s, all of the GIs, were back from the war. They started forming families. They started to get involved in communities. And all of a sudden, there were all these people who were joining churches, and church attendance skyrocketed during the late 1950s. And you can see that effect on the churches across the United States, because that's when they had to expand all these churches to allow all the additional people that were coming. In the 1950s, GIs not only joined churches, they joined all sorts of civic, organizations. They were just joiners left and right. And so, but, church attendance in particular really skyrocketed. Okay, so we went from sort of the 1930s, 1940s level of church attendance. It went up. You should imagine it going dramatically up through the 1950s. And then, here comes the first earthquake. First earthquake happened. First earthquake was the 1960s. Boom! There we go. So what happened during the 1960s? It was really all about tolerance for premarital sex. That's what it came down to. And that completely changed the landscape again. What happened is, this is pretty dramatic. The fraction of all Americans believing that premarital sex was, quote, not wrong, doubled from 24% to 47% in the 4 years between 1969 and 1973, and then drifted upwards through the 1970s to 62% in 1982. So it was a huge earthquake, really changed people's attitudes, and it had an immediate effect on church attendance. It plummeted during the what they like to call the long 60s, because it extended into the 1970s as well. All right, so then we have an aftershock. So what was this aftershock? Aftershock happened when there was a reaction by the children of all those people who grew up to the 60s, where they actually became more conservative. I like to think of that as the Michael Keaton effect. Did you guys ever see Family Ties? You know what Family Ties is? Oh, well, in Family Ties, he's the son, and he's much more conservative than his two hippie parents. And so he's always saying, he's for... Fox. Yeah, Michael J. Fox plays that. Yeah. I think his character is Michael. Oh well, I'll have to look it up. But he's, so he's much more conservative, and the joke is he's always correcting his parents. Apparently, that was true. I mean, there was this generation in the late 1970s, 1980s that were much more conservative than their parents. And the three areas where they were more conservative was, number one, homosexuality, number two, abortion, and number three, marijuana. As the 60s receded in the rearview mirror, views among younger Americans in the 1970s and 1980s actually moved in a conservative direction. Among 18 to 29-year-olds, the view that homosexuality was always wrong rose from 62% in 1974 to 79% in 1987. And opposition to marijuana rose from 50% in 1976 to 80% in 1990. So again, pretty dramatic change in attitudes over a very small period of time. But this time people are moving to be more conservative. This was the rise of the religious right? This is when say no to drugs, the religious right, back to family values, go back to old-time religion. This is that aftershock. And it happened during the late 1970s and the early 1980s. Okay, so religious attendance went up after this aftershock. Okay, but we have another aftershock. Final aftershock happened in 1990s, early 2000s. This is a reaction that Americans had about the identification of religion with Republican values, about combining being religious and being Republican. So it was a reaction to the conservative nature of religion. This was the rise of the nuns. And I don't mean, nuns as in black habits. I mean nuns as in people who, when they filled out the religious surveys, they marked none for their religious affiliation. They didn't consider themselves part of any religion at all. This was driven by two attitudes, views on homosexuality and again on marijuana. Those were the two deciding factors. What they say is, in unacademically vivid language intended for clarity's sake, but at the risk of oversimplification, we argue that throughout these last 5 decades, libertines and prudes have in sequence provoked one another. Liberal sexual morality provoked some Americans to assert conservative religious beliefs and affiliations, and then conservative sexual morality provoked other Americans to assert secular beliefs and affiliations. So anyway, so with the nuns, again, religious attendance plummeted again. And so we'll talk about a little more about what's happening with that trend. So, the overall picture, 1930s and 40s were really just about back to religious attendance at that period. So that whole roller coaster in between. We start here in 1950s, skyrocketed. We had a couple of plunges and we're back to where we started again. So it's not, pretty much people's private beliefs have stayed constant. It's the religious attendance, and what people think about religion has changed dramatically over the last 70 years. All right, so let's talk about that religious landscape, what Americans actually believe right now, according to the surveys. And what they discovered was about 10% of Americans are true believers. They are the true believers. 10% might not seem like a lot, but there's 320 million Americans, so 10% would be like 32 million. Yes?
What do you mean by that? What's the definition of true believer?
Oh, yeah, I'll explain what a true believer is. A true believer is someone who believes in the literal truth of the Bible, who has every possible conservative belief that you might want to imagine. They're as conservative as you can get. And they're...
But we're not going to call that fundamentalism?
We can call it, I think it'll make more sense when I contrast it with the other two. But yeah, so they did a lot of surveys. And what they did is they really tried to zero in on exactly what the beliefs were. But these were people who believed in the literal truth of the Bible. They were anti-abortion under any circumstance at all. They just have a whole list of different characteristics that put them way into the extreme. So if you think of the most extreme conservative possible, you're thinking of a true believer. Yep. And then, so you have the true believers on one side, and then nuns, which we just talked about, the people who mark, no religious affiliation. They represented at this time 17% of the entire population. So you have 17% on one side, about 10% on the other, and then you have about 80% in between, plus or minus a little bit. Now, I want, first off, I should point out that one of the purposes of this book was to point out that there is a huge change in the way that religion and American politics mixed, because it used to be true that there is as many there are as many Christian left-wing and right-wing participants. But one of the things that's happened over the last, especially since the 1950s, is pretty much if you're a nun, then you are in fact going to be left-leaning, and if you are a conservative, then you'll be on the religious side of things. So this is called the God gap. And the idea of the God gap is there's not as many people, who are in the middle in terms of religious beliefs versus no religious beliefs. Okay. Most American, the interesting thing though about the people in the middle, the 80% or so in the middle, is that they believe that there are multiple paths to heaven. And so they have a belief that one of the changes, the other changes they want to talk about is, given all these different religions, how is it possible that America has been so tolerant to people with different beliefs? And what they want to claim is it's because most people know people from other religions. And so, and it also, because of that, it makes it hard for an American to say any of their friends are going to go to heaven, right? It's hard to say if you know Uncle Al, and Al's a nice guy. It's kind of hard to believe that Uncle Al is going to go to hell. And since most people are exposed to people who have different religious backgrounds, people are pretty tolerant about it. So one of the things that this survey discovered was a whopping 89% of Americans believe that heaven is not reserved for those who share their religious faith. So you don't have to be a Protestant. You can be a Jew, and you can still go to heaven. You can be a Mormon, and you can still go to heaven. You don't have to be a Protestant, or you don't have to be a Catholic, or you don't have to be a particular religion. If you're religious at all, you get a ticket through the gate, right? That's the important thing. You have to be religious. This was a change in Americans' attitude about religion. If you go back to, there's something called the Middletown studies. So Middletown, which is really a code word for Muncie, Indiana, is the most studied city in the United States. They've had all of these surveys and studies done there. They did a study back in 1924 where they discovered that 94% of the population reported that Christianity is the one true religion. So if you went back to 1924, visited Muncie, Indiana, and said, all right, how do I get into heaven? You have to be a Christian. Or otherwise you're not getting into heaven. In 1977, only 38% reported that Christianity is the one true religion. So that's a huge change again. So we've gone from 94% to only 38%. And the important thing to understand here is people didn't become less religious. They just changed their beliefs about one particular religion being true. They're still as religious in terms of, all the other measures that they have in terms of their beliefs. It's just that they no longer say that the only path is, a particular path. Any religion will work. Now, this is actually pretty shocking to the clergy, which is so the authors also presented this information to, they did surveys among the clergy, and of course the clergy is saying, well, of course you have to believe in this particular religion to go to heaven. Why aren't the people listening to us when we're up there at the pulpit telling them, you have to believe us or you're not going? But the weird thing about this is the actual Americans sitting out there in the pews, they believe something very different than what the clergy is presenting them because, again, the Uncle Al effect. Most people just can't imagine people that they know, friends of theirs, going to hell. And so regardless of what that clergy guy is saying, they believe that, everyone gets into heaven regardless of their religion. Okay, so that's the majority of Americans. Majority of Americans are nice. They have a sort of, general view that if you're religious at all, then you're a good person. Let's talk about the nuns. So the nuns, in the original surveys, the nuns, as I said, represented 17% of the overall population. But one of the things that's important to do on these statistics is they want to look at generational changes, right? Because there's big differences depending on which age group that you look at. And one of the things they discovered is along the younger population in the original surveys, the nuns represented about 25% of the population. Now that's not surprising because as people age, they tend to get more religious, right? So, they age into, most people start attending church more and more as they get older. They get more conservative views toward religion. So the fact that, 25% of people starting out in their surveys, that's not particularly surprising. The other thing that they pointed out is in the original book, it's important to be clear that nuns are not atheists. They're not the same as atheists at all. And in fact, the authors of the book are pretty dismissive about atheists. They said of their survey, they surveyed 3,108 Americans in the initial survey. Guess how many identified themselves as atheists in the original survey? Anything? Any
10%?
10%? Yeah, you got it. 5. Exactly 5. Okay. So it wasn't, they couldn't do any statistically significant stuff with only 5 people identifying themselves as an atheist. So it's just there's such a minor, special, I'll say. It's just a small percentage of the overall people that it was, wasn't covered by their surveys. All right, so who are these nuns then? Nuns are from the left. They're more accepting of homosexuality. They're more accepting of marijuana. They divide them into 2 types. The 2 types of nuns are, number 1, the true nuns. You can be a true nun. And those are people of antipathy against organized religion. So people who actually hate the idea of organized religion. And we all have met atheists like that, right? Who just hate the idea of any sort of organized religion at all. And driven mainly by a negative reaction to conservative politics. So they became nun because they felt they were thrown outside of, they didn't agree with the conservative politics and they don't like organized religion. The other type of nun they call the liminal nuns, and these are guys who flicker in and out of being religious. So on one survey they'll say that they're religious, and the next survey they say they're not, and so they go back and forth. So they tend to not be very, very involved in their community. They tend to change their religious beliefs, from survey to survey. And so they actually said that there's more liminal nuns than the other type of nuns because only half of them are counted at a time because the other half are hiding out in whichever religion they have for that year. So those are the nuns. Now, one of the changes that I should mention is in the follow-up survey in 2011. Remember, this was done after the initial book was published. This was carried in the epilogue. He talks about that nuns have now crept up to 19% of the overall population. But the more dramatic thing here is in terms of young people, they're now 33%, which is, significant increase in the number of nuns. It went from 25% to 33%. So we're talking a big chunk of people are people who just say, well, we're not part of any organized religion at all. All right, so on to his argument. So what Putnam and Campbell argue is that religious Americans are better people. And let me explain why they think they're better people. First, they claim that religious Americans are better neighbors. They volunteer more. In particular, if you volunteer for a religious group, then you're 91% likely to also volunteer for at least one secular group. So volunteering for a religious group is highly, highly correlated. Talking 91% with volunteering in general. In round numbers, regular churchgoers are more than twice as likely to volunteer to help the needy compared to demographically matched Americans who rarely, if ever, attend church. So they volunteer more in the community. Religious people are also more likely to give to charity. Other things being equal, the likelihood that an American who never attends church will give money to the American Cancer Society, the Boy or Girl Scouts, a local art museum, or some other secular organization is 60%, whereas the likelihood of a similar contribution from a comparable person who attends church weekly is 81%. So we've gone from 60% to 81%. Again, a pretty big jump there. The main message, though, about volunteering and giving is that it doesn't really seem to matter which religion that you're a part of. The primary predictor of generosity is how intense your religiousness is, how often you attend, how strong your beliefs are. That's the thing that determines your involvement in volunteering. In fact, this is a quote, in fact, the statistics suggest that even an atheist, one of those 5 people, even an atheist who happened to become involved in the social life of a congregation is much more likely to volunteer in a soup kitchen than the most fervent believer who prays alone. It is religious belonging that matters for neighborliness, not religious believing. So that's one of their main conclusions from the book, is religion is all about belonging, not believing, is what they want to claim. Okay, so religious people contribute to the community more. They're better citizens. But the other thing is religious people are happier. So religiosity is among the closest correlates of life satisfaction, at least as strong as income. So other things being equal, the difference in happiness between a non-churchgoer and a weekly churchgoer is slightly larger than the difference between someone who owns $10,000 a year and his demographic twin who owns $100,000 a year. So going to church, worth $90,000 according to this math right here, says it. And again, as with good neighborliness, theological and denominational differences appear to have virtually nothing to do with the linkage between life satisfaction and religiosity. All right, so now let me just explain the central message of the book is it is tempting to think that religious people are better neighbors because of their fear of God or their hope of salvation or the reading of the good word, but we find no evidence for these conjectures. Once we know how observant a person is in terms of church attendance, nothing that we can discover about the content of her religious faith adds anything to her understanding or prediction of her good neighborliness. Nothing about her views about the Bible, or life after death, or evolution, or her personal experience of God, or the kind of God she believes in, or the importance of religion in her life or in her personal political decisions, or her views about morality, or salvation, or evolution, or judgment day, or the rapture, or her habits of saying grace or reading scripture. It is a belonging that matters, not believing. Sorry, that was kind of a long quote, but that's the central message of the book. Most important thing, got to be religious. That's what leads people to be better neighbors and to contribute more to charity and to lead happier lives. All right, so the obvious question that comes up there is why? Why does being involved in a religion actually make people happier and better citizens? So what Putnam and Campbell say is they analyze it in terms of having friends at church is the magic ingredient. Having religious friends is more important than simply having friends and being religious yourself. It is in this sense that religious networks are synergistic or supercharged in their effect on neighborliness. So it's not a very satisfying explanation. They're basically saying, well, having friends at church makes you happy and also makes you more moral and more involved in the community. So that's why I want to turn to the second book and talk a little more about Alain de Botton's book on religion for atheists. And this is his A Non-Believer's Guide to the Uses of Religion. How many people have read this, by the way? It's a great book if you haven't read it. So it's interesting. It's very different, though. This is not a data-driven book. The first book was written by Harvard professors. You know, it's all based on the surveys. This Alain de Botton book is completely speculative. He's just, you know, giving personal insights into why he thinks religion is valuable. So it's a very different approach, but I think it's an interesting approach. The premise of this book is that it must be possible to remain a committed atheist and nevertheless find religion sporadically useful, interesting, and consoling, and be curious to the possibilities of importing certain of their ideas and practices into the secular realm. So overall, he thinks, look, these institutions have been around for thousands of years. There must be some reason. They must serve some function in our society, or otherwise these religious institutions wouldn't have persisted for so long. He points out they've affected our art, our clothing, everything, our architecture, everything about our lives. So let's figure out what we can still appropriate from religions and use in an atheist world. That's really what he's after in the book. He states his main conclusion like this: we can then recognize that we invented religions to serve two central needs, which continue to this day and which secular society has not been able to solve with any particular skill. First, the need to live together in communities in harmony despite our deeply rooted selfish and violent impulses. And second, the need to cope with terrifying degrees of pain which arise from our vulnerability to professional failure, to troubled relationships, to the death of loved ones, and to our decay and demise. It's a little depressing, actually, but that's what he says. That's what religion's for. Okay, so let's talk about his ideas. Obviously, I can't talk about all of his ideas. It was a good book. It was an interesting book. But I want to focus on what he says about community and dealing with pain. Starting with community, he says, you know, everyone recognizes that we have less community now. There's something about modern society where we lost it. And he said there's no surprise there. It's impossible for us to say hello to everyone on the street anymore because people pass thousands of people on the street every day, especially if you live in a big city. You just would never get to work. You're packed into a subway. You're not going to greet everyone on the subway. Just too many people. So when you have that many people roaming around, you can't have the same sort of community that people fantasize in old villages. Okay, so when we do have the opportunity to interact with people, oftentimes it's, well, let me just quote what he says. Insofar as modern society ever promises access to a community, it is one centered around the worship of success. So he says the most common question that he's asked when he meets someone new is, what do you do for a living? And where do your kids go to school? Which are really, you know, often just, you know, secret attempts to figure out success metrics. So, and this causes most of us to throw ourselves into our careers because we want to come out well on answers to those questions. And so it drives us to have the psychological need to be able to answer those questions in a positive way. What he wants to claim is religion, and church in particular, creates a space for community because it brings together people from all walks of life into a single room. This is what Campbell and Putnam called social bridging. They're very invested in the idea of social bridging. This idea of one of the things that a church offers is a way for people from different backgrounds to interact. So the other part of church is you're actually encouraged to greet people in a church, unlike, you know, random people passing on the street, where that would seem very weird if you try to greet everyone on the street. So it's a way to build a community because it's a loud space within the church. He also claims that the church values more than worldly success. Quote, The church does more, however, than merely declare that worldly success doesn't matter. In a variety of ways, it enables us to imagine that we could be happy without it. Appreciating the reasons why we try to acquire status in the first place, the church establishes conditions under which we can willingly surrender our attachment to class and titles. It seems to know that we strive to be powerful chiefly because we are afraid of what will happen to us without high rank. We risk being stripped of dignity, being patronized, lacking friends, and having to spend our days in coarse and dispiriting surroundings. He's so negative. This is what Putnam and Campbell would refer to as stressing altruistic values. Going to a church is not like going to a country club. There are differences in organizations because when you're going to a church, you're supposed to be focusing on things that aren't worldly values. You're supposed to be focusing more on moral questions and questions of happiness. So, Alain, this is kind of weird, but Alain imagines an atheist restaurant that embodies these values. So he says, okay, so they're going to have churches. Let's imagine we've created this perfect atheist restaurant where we can recreate in an atheist setting some of the things that people would get from a church. So in his atheist restaurant, he calls it the agape restaurant, for Greek word for love. The agape restaurant, people go in, there's a big table, everyone has to sit together at the table, strangers get together, and there's a little guidebook on each seat. So when you go in, you can't ask the person next to you, hey, what do you do for a living? You also don't have to be confused. You look at the guidebook and say, oh, there's certain questions I'm supposed to ask in the atheist restaurant. So the questions you're supposed to ask are things like, what do you regret? That's a good question for the atheist restaurant. What do you fear? Instead of what do you do or where do your children go to school? So the idea is it's supposed to get people talking at the level of true values instead of worldly values. Anyway, so that's this little fantasy. He wants to start a chain of atheist restaurants. So let's move on to another purpose that he sees the church as fulfilling, mending social conflict. So he talks a lot about different Jewish traditions. He came from a Jewish background, so he talks about the importance of different Jewish holidays for making sure that you have a smoothly running community. He talks, for example, about Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, the practice that people... Is everyone familiar with Yom Kippur? So it's the most important day in the Jewish calendar. Together in the synagogue, Jews must say in prayer, we have sinned, we have acted treacherously, we have robbed, we have spoken slander, we have acted perversely, we have acted wickedly, we have acted presumptuously, we have been violent, we have framed lies. You then have to make a list of everyone you've offended over the last year and go and make apologies. So what he's suggesting is that atheists, they should at least quarterly do the same thing. They should create a list of people, make up for all the bad stuff they did for social mending. Okay, so I'm going to skip a little bit of this, and let's go to coping with pain. So he spent some time talking about the book of Job. And I just want to remind you of the story of the book of Job and then talk about his analysis and what he would consider the atheist equivalent to the book of Job. So just as a reminder of the story, the book of Job, Job has everything, right? He starts out, he has everything. He has a large house, he has 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 donkeys. He's living large. He has everything you could ever want. But then, of course, one day, single day, he loses everything, right? He loses everything. A bolt of lightning comes from the sky and kills all his sheep. His camels and donkeys are stolen by neighboring tribes. A hurricane kills all his children. And sores grow across his body and can't even move without being in pain. So, of course, all his friends in the community said, well, you must have done something bad. I mean, seriously, look at this guy. Single day? I mean, you must have offended God in some way, because that's, otherwise that's just horrible, right? All these bad things can happen to someone. But Job knows in his heart, he hasn't done anything bad. I mean, he was just living his life the normal way, and then all of a sudden, all this misfortune hit him all at once. And so Job asks, God, why are you doing this to me? And then he starts to question God's existence, right? So he questions God's existence. And then a furious God answers through a desert whirlwind. Who is this that darketh counsel by words without knowledge? Gird up now thy loins like a man, for I will demand of thee. Where wast thou when I laid the foundations of the earth? Declare if thou hast understanding. By what way is a light parted, which scattereth the east wind upon the earth? Out of whose womb came the ice, and the hoary frost of heaven? Knowest thou the ordinance of heaven? Doth the hawk fly by thy wisdom? Canst thou draw out leviathans with a hook? That's pretty impressive. So that's God's response. And so basically what God is saying is, Job, you should be ashamed of yourself. You're such a petty speck in the universe of things that you worrying about your little problems, you know, the sores on your body, your dead sheep, really, I don't care. I have to keep the hawks flying here. What you're focused on is these, you know, little petty things, and you should be overcome with awe and humility and get on with your life. All right, so Alain de Botton, in response to this, he writes, the signal danger of life in a godless society is that it lacks reminders of the transcendent and therefore leaves us unprepared for disappointment and eventual annihilation. When God is dead, human beings, much to their detriment, are at risk of taking psychological center stage. They imagine themselves to be commanders of their own destinies. They trample upon nature, forget the rhythms of the earth, deny death, and shy away from valuing and honoring all that slips through their grasp, until at last they must collide catastrophically with the sharp edges of reality. Our secular world is lacking the sorts of rituals that might put us gently in our place. It surreptitiously invites us to think of the present moment as the summit of history and the achievements of our fellow humans as the measure of all things, a grandiosity that plunges us into continuous swirls of anxiety and envy. So basically he's agreeing. He's saying that, hey, you know, part of the problem of secular society is we think we're the center of all things. And so we should strive to have the same transcendent sense of awe that would give us the humility to be able to face our misfortunes without, you know, despair. And so in particular, he said, we should look at astronomy. He says, science should matter to us not only because it helps us to control parts of the world, but also because it shows us things that we will never master. Thus, we would do well to meditate daily, rather as the religious do, on their God, on the 9.5 trillion kilometers which comprise a single light year, or perhaps on the luminosity of the largest known star in our galaxy, Eta Carina, 7,500 years light distance, 400 times the size of the sun, and 4 million times as bright. So what he's really saying is, you know, you're worried about all your sheep dying, about all the sores on your body. Well, think of the giant universe, and all your worries will go away. You'll think of yourself in a more humble way, and you won't have those fears anymore. That doesn't, I have to tell you, that doesn't really work for me, but that's what he's saying. All right, so let me get to the final conclusion. The conclusion that Alain has for his book, Why Religion, is those of us who hold no religious or supernatural beliefs still require regular ritualized encounters with concepts such as friendship, community, gratitude, and transcendence. We cannot rely on being able to make our way to them on our own. We need institutions that can remind us that we will need them and present them to us in appealing wrappings, thus ensuring the nourishment of the most forgetful and unself-aware sides of our souls. So basically what he's saying is we need an atheist church for friendship, community, gratitude, and transcendence, because we can't do this stuff on our own. So let me stop here, and do we still have time for discussion? All right. So